Hey everyone. Hi, I am Ashley Troth. I am the horticulture agent for Durham County Cooperative Extension, and I am excited to be sharing with you today our Intro to Insects section. This will hopefully get you ready, kind of thinking about insects broadly in the environment, and also a little bit more specific of how to ID different things. And this should really set you up for Debbie Ruse's presentation so that you're kind of ready to go with some of this background information, and you can just have fun learning about pollinators and pollinator plants and all that kind of stuff when you're in Chatham. So this lecture is a little bit longer, so just to kind of give you an overview of what we'll be covering, we're going to start with kind of all about insects, just a real kind of bird's eye evolutionary view, learning about insects in the ecosystem and different roles they can fill, a little bit of who did this. Oftentimes we don't see the insect, we just see the damage they do or kind of their impact. Sometimes you'll hear me say things that sound not positive about insects. That's only because I'm coming more from a horticulture perspective. But when I say damage, I really just mean their impact on plants. So how they chew them, how they eat them. And that's not always really a problem even from the plant's perspective. We're going to do a little bit of getting to know the neighbors. So understanding insects in a broader context and how can we help. My goal is to upload this with timestamps for each of these different sections. So if you get through a couple and you need to take a break, the YouTube video will have timestamps for where we start each additional one, and you can see that below in the comments. All right, so starting off, what are insects? What are we even talking about here? So insects are really, really interesting because of kind of where they're situated in the broader tree of life, and I find this really, really helpful to think about. So just as an aside, I have another screen over here, so if you see me glancing over here, it's just because it's a little bit bigger and a little bit easier for me to see. But so when we think about insects, we're really thinking about this group of things called arthropods. And so arthropods will include insects, but they'll also include some other things. So arthropods will also include, for example, trilobites, which are extinct now, myriapods, so this is going to be centipedes and millipedes, chelicerates, which are spiders, crustaceans, which are really just sea bugs, which I find very amusing that every time you eat something like a lobster or a crab, you're just eating a sea bug or a water bug. And then insects. And so we're going to see a lot of this sort of layout kind of in this class and also as we go forward in classes. And it can be helpful to understand how this sort of tree of life works if you're not familiar with it. Two things that are close like this means that they have a very recent common ancestor. This is kind of the most recent point in time. Oftentimes at the top of the map here or on the right-hand side in some of these, that is the most recent common relationships. And the further back you go, right, this common ancestor is more recent than this common ancestor. So insects are really most closely related to the crustaceans. This can be really, really interesting to think about when we think about how insects actually evolved, right? So keep in mind that some of their close relatives have really, really different numbers of segments and really, really different numbers of legs than insects do. So how does that play out? So insects started evolving about 480 million years ago. This is around the same time as land plants, which is really interesting, but it was slightly later than land plants, but we can think of it as being around the same time. They first evolved flight around 400 million years ago, and there was a major radiation between 350 and 300 million years ago. And what do I mean by that? A radiation, when we say that from an evolutionary perspective, means that the forms there were so many more forms, there were so many more species, there was so much kind of evolution diversity generated at these specific points in time. And it's just because everything was right for evolution to try out a whole bunch of different new things. And so even though insects might have showed up around 480 million years ago, and they start flying 400 million years ago, it was only between 300 and 350 that you start seeing a huge diversity of insect forms and flying insect forms. The earliest modern insect orders started appearing about 250 million years ago. So what we think of as contemporary insects only start showing up there. And what was happening kind of for the 200 plus million years before that has largely been lost to extinction and lost to other major changes. And then another major radiation of orders occurs 145 to around 65 million years ago. And we'll see later in the talk that radiation, that kind of evolutionary explosion actually lines up with the evolution of flowering plants, which is really cool. And so this figure on the right, I just love this. I think this is such a cool fact about insects. So insects evolved from a common ancestor that had way more segments and way more legs. Think about something more in line with like a trilobite or even a centipede or a millipede, right? So lots of segments, lots of legs. And what happens is you can think of that as kind of this form here, like form B. As insects evolve, the number of segments actually decreases, and so does the number of legs, right? So this actually, form C has slightly fewer segments, especially around the head. Some segments are combining. By the time you get to D, you have, right, fewer legs again, you only have 3 pairs of kind of really standard legs as we would think about them, and a bunch of little tiny like leglets, right, where evolution is kind of slowly selecting those legs to be lost. And then finally, by the time we get to E, we get to something that looks, in some ways like a grasshopper, right, like conceptually. And so what happens there is that, like, for insects, they a whole bunch of different segments from their ancestor combined to make the head. And so what would happen there is, like, the mandibles that they have would have been more like legs, but now they've been co-opted to be mouth parts. And they've lost all this. But what it means is that all along the body, there is still kind of this ancestral machinery that could have been used to make legs, could have been used to make segments, but it's been turned off or made dormant by evolution. And so what's really phenomenal about that is that oftentimes when something is turned off, it starts breaking down, but it also starts evolving in different ways. Because if you need to have a leg, right, evolution helps you have that leg and have it properly, right? Because any organism that is born with a leg that's not formed properly is selected against. Whereas if you don't need to have a leg, and actually the leg was turned off, what's really phenomenal then is that all the machinery that was used to build the leg is just kind of sitting there, and it'll start being able to evolve a little bit more freely because there's not as strong of selection to keep it exactly the way it needs to be. And so what happened with insects is because they have all this machinery, right? Remember along in here for legs and segments. Now that's been able to be used for so many different things. So that was part of that machinery in these insects got turned into wings. It got turned into horns, and all of those you can view as these kind of support structures that are evolution is able to build out of like the broken machinery of the things it used to do. And this is really, really cool. And so again, I'll talk about evolution in these sort of like anthropomorphic terms because it's just kind of easier for the brain to understand. But remember, there's no choice here. There's no plan here. It's just give a million insects a million years and all of a sudden like things start showing up and new structures start appearing. And so this can be really, really interesting. One of my favorite examples of this is going to be in kind of the leafhopper group, where you see some of those old segments, right, green coded here, turning into different wing structures, and you see some of them turning into those really intricate back structures they have to make them look like spines and prickles and everything else so that they can camouflage into plants better. One of the labs I worked in undergrad, actually, one of the researchers we were working with was showing how the light organs of fireflies are probably also kind of co-opted machinery from these sort of ancestral leg and segment bits, right? And so all those light organs on the undersides perfectly overlap with where they would have had legs, right? And so the idea there is that you have all this really intricate machinery that you're not using for anything, so evolution finds something new to do with it, which is really cool. And so part of this is why you see so much diversity and so much capacity for diversity in insects is because of this kind of history, and also just they've had time to evolve and do a lot of different things, which is pretty cool. And so when we're thinking about insects, I think it can be really, really helpful to kind of put them in context because, like, let's be real, insects rule the world, right? They're doing all the things, they're everywhere all the time. So this is a great graph where they show kind of the number of species, and this is insects, and then kind of everything else getting eaten like a little Pac-Man segment. But to put that in numbers, we have about 5,400 species of mammal on the globe. Fascinatingly enough, like 1,200 of those are bats, right? So like, if you're trying to guess what a mammal is in a like guess this mammal game, just start with a bat. It's probably a bat, right? Like that's just odds are it's probably a bat. But within, right, so that's how we think of, we are mammals, so we tend to be somewhat mammal oriented. Like we tend to think about humans and things like that. But really, this dwarfs in comparison to the number of plants. There are about 390,000 plus species of plants. We're discovering new ones all the time. So this just puts the mammal number to shame. Of those plants, 25,000 plus of them are orchids, right? Orchids are extremely diverse. They have a whole bunch of different ways to do things. They have a whole bunch of different ways to kind of adapt to their local environments. So they have an extreme diversity. And that all seems pretty impressive, right? Like there are 5 times as many orchids as there are mammals. So many insects. So many insects, right? And this is a huge range too, right? 6 to 10 million species of insects. And you're like, why? What about that 4 million in the middle? Like, how do we account for that? It's because we know we've underdiscovered them. We're finding new ones all the time. And this just is an estimate based on like a bunch of scientists who looked around in different places, and they just have a sense of like how much they're missing. And so then you kind of estimate that more broadly on a global scale. And you can tell that there might be 10 million plus species of insects. Right? Only 1 million of those are described. So we just know that there's a tremendous amount of insect life out there that we have no idea what it is. We don't know what it's doing. We don't know what it's contributing. We just know it must be there based on like modeling. And of those that are described, right, 400,000 plus of them are beetles. One of my favorite quotes from evolutionary biology is that there's an old evolutionary biologist, and it was, the creator must have an inordinate fondness for beetles, right? There are so many of them. Beetles were an early fascination for Darwin, and they kind of remain a really fascinating place because of the diversity. We'll see that a little bit in some later slides, but in general, like I said, if you're going to guess what kind of mammal, guess is it a bat. If someone just wants you to guess what kind of organism, guess a beetle, right? It's probably a beetle. And what's really helpful to know about this, and we're going to think about it from a naturalist perspective, but this is helpful just in talking to people because people often have kind of a, don't like bugs, right? But less than 1% of these are considered pests, serious pests. So the vast majority of insects in your garden, in your environment, wherever they are just like doing their thing. And kind of want nothing to do with you, totally honestly. They don't even really necessarily want anything to do with your plants in a meaningful way. They're just doing their thing, helping the environment, helping us all. So many things, so many insects, and most of them are neutral to beneficial, which is awesome. So when we talk about insects, let's dive a little bit into what we mean very specifically. So insect anatomy and morphology. So insects there's some things that are always the same for the most part in adult insects, right? Which is that they have 3 body segments, a head, a thorax, and an abdomen. They have 6 legs in 3 pairs, right? 1, 2, 3 pairs of legs, so 6 in total. They have 2 antennae, and that's really how you build an insect. And sometimes it can be helpful to know that it's not always so obvious when you look at them. So one of my favorite examples are the true bugs have a group where their wings have formed over the back of their body into these kind of shield-like structures. So if you look at that, it kind of looks like body and like head. If I squint, maybe, I guess that's a head. But if you were to flip this thing over, if you were to actually take a look at it, you would again see head, thorax, abdomen, right? Like you're going to see that every single time. That's in contrast to something like spiders, where you're going to see a main body and a head and 8 legs, right? So you have to have 3 segments. You have to have 6 legs and 2 antennae. The exception to this, why I kind of like waffled earlier, is because larvae are weird, right? Immature insect forms are weird. And so if you look at a caterpillar, for example, you'll wonder like why, but there's so many legs on an inchworm. How does that work? And there's not really 3 segments. Well, all bets are kind of off when it comes to immature forms. So larvae, grubs, caterpillars, oftentimes will have what looks like more legs, but actually if you were to be kind of an entomology nerd about it, you would be able to see that the first legs in the front are often true legs, and the legs in the back are what we call prolegs. They're like fleshy outgrowths. So that's kind of how an entomologist squares that circle. The other times you might see slightly odd body configurations are in some of the scale insects or other insects that have highly evolved forms where they basically like have there are certain insects where their life strategy is to like hook into the vascular system of a plant and just sit there and suck sugar water, right? And so they actually don't have as much body as you might think, because like they just don't need it. They're not out there wandering around, right? So they have these kind of highly devolved bodies, which sounds crazy, but it's actually because they're so highly evolved for a specific thing, right? So, but in general, let's just say 3 segments, 6 legs, 2 antennae, and move on, right? Life is full of exceptions, so you'll have to accept that. But in general, this is kind of where you can go. Inside the body of an insect, it gets even more interesting, which I just love. So this is a diagram of a honeybee. We'll talk about this more later, but honeybees, like, we all love them. We all love honey. Sure, I'm not a monster, but also please keep in mind that honeybees are European. They're not native. We have a lot of our own native bees. They're wonderful and we should be supporting them. Honeybees are like escaped livestock, okay? And so I like them, but I always just have to give that disclaimer that honeybees are escaped livestock at best, and there are other native bees we should be supporting, but that's an aside. So for this honeybee, what I think is really interesting about this diagram is it kind of shows you that their bodies are laid out really differently than ours. So we have an endoskeleton. Our bones are on the inside. Insects have an exoskeleton. Their bones are on the outside. They do not have a vascular system the way we do. They just have like crunchy outside, gooey inside, right? They have hemolymph, which is insect blood, and their organs are just kind of suspended in that hemolymph. Because they don't have a vascular system moving blood around, they have to kind of get worried about stagnation of that hemolymph. So oftentimes they'll have like these little specialized pumps throughout the body and at the kind of connection point for each leg to keep that hemolymph moving. They don't have lungs the way we do. Instead, they just allow oxygen to diffuse into that hemolymph through tiny holes on their body called spiracles. What else do they have that's really interesting? They have a brain, kind of, but they also have more like subganglia as well. So they'll have one central kind of coordinating thing in the head, but then they have more coordination down the body as well than we typically do. They're really, really fascinating. One of the things I think is so interesting about this is that these structures are all really, really intricate, really detailed, they're doing so much complicated stuff, and they're tiny, which is just crazy to me, because when you think about like, if a bee is only that big and it's got all this going on inside there, that's crazy. That's just like a fun little thing to think about, everything going on inside that bee. And so insects nowadays often are quite small, but historically they could get very large. So this is a great example of a dragonfly ancestor that was able to live around 300 million years ago. Right here's catching a newt. Here's a woman holding a model of it. This thing was massive, right? Like it was bigger than a small bird. And it was able to do all of this because actually around 300 million years ago, there were higher oxygen levels in the atmosphere. And so the air was denser. And so it could support bigger bodied insects, right? They could fly more effectively, which is super cool. So like this kind of thing couldn't survive now only because it wouldn't be able to fly because our oxygen or our air is too thin. And so kind of on the extreme other end of that, like what I was saying with the cell thing, right? Imagine fruit flies are tiny. There are insects that are smaller than fruit flies. There are insects that are so small that the way they move through air, it's more like swimming than flying, right? Because you get to a small enough level that you're kind of paddling your way through as opposed to trying to keep yourself up on top of it. So I think that's so cool. So that's kind of our insect basics, shifting a little bit toward metamorphosis. This is really, really important. We're going to talk about the 2 major styles of metamorphosis for insects. This really is one of the most important facts for insects. This is all about their life history, all about how they kind of make a go of it. And this is a very distinguishing feature. So first we're going to talk about gradual or incomplete metamorphosis, then we're going to talk about complete. So starting with gradual, this is where insects hatch out of their little eggs and they kind of look like little versions of the adults, right? The color might change going from this bright reddy orange to a brown. They might get wings, right? Like there might be some minor changes along the way, but this is very, very familiar, right? So I like to think of this as like, I have a 2-year-old. He's awesome. He does not look like me in his body, right? Like he's got a much bigger tummy, like he's got like kind of a different way of going about the world. When he was born, he looked like a human, but kind of, right? Like their proportions are different, right? Like they're very cute, they're very wonderful, but they're like, it's not like you took an adult man and just made him that tall, right? Like the proportions are very, very different. But you can squint and see how he will turn into an adult human, right? That's kind of where we are here. So the insects that go through this are going to be all of our bugs. Bugs means something to an entomologist. It's the Hymenoptera. That's not true. It's the Hemiptera. Sorry, Hymenoptera is ants, bees, and wasps. It's the Hemiptera. It's also things like mantises, grasshoppers and katydids, cockroaches, all of that kind of stuff. Fun fact, cockroaches and mantises are sister taxa. They are extremely closely related, which is really fun because they don't look like they would be. Taking that one step further, termites are really actually just highly specialized social wood cockroaches, right? They are also very closely related, which is fun. But so this gradual or incomplete metamorphosis is this sort of just gradual growth of the body through a series of molts, right? Because insects have that exoskeleton, they can't just get bigger. Every time you really want to get bigger, you have to shed your exoskeleton and do a new one. So you'll go through any number of different nymph stages, gradually shed the final layer, and then come out as an adult like this and exist that way until you participate in egg laying one way or the other. And that's in contrast to complete metamorphosis. This is fascinating. This is like if my son was born looking like a cigar, right? Looking like a tiny little caterpillar or something. And then at one point decided to become a pod person and then emerged as an adult, right? Bizarro. So this is just a really fascinating thing. Evolutionary biologists don't 100% understand how it happened, like how this came into being, but there's an idea that what's happening is kind of a shifting of when some of the embryonic stages happen. So some of the embryonic stages might actually be happening out of the egg, which is cool. So what happens in complete metamorphosis, you have eggs laid, and then a larva emerges, and this might be a larva, a caterpillar, a grub, a maggot. We have all sorts of different names for this phase. Then you go into a pupa, also sometimes called a cocoon or a chrysalis, and that entire larval body is basically melted down, and then the adult emerges. The way that this is accomplished is that actually when the larva hatches, it has a number of populations of stem cells set aside within its body, that when it goes into its pupa, it activates those stem cell populations to create all of the adult structures. And so basically, like, you melt everything down, but you have those little stem cells to make the adult structures, you rebuild the body, and you emerge as an adult, which is awesome and crazy. And so some of the examples of insects that go through this are going to be butterflies and moths, beetles, flies, and then ants, bees, and wasps. And there are others that do as well, but these are kind of our major players. It's helpful to realize that there is so much diversity in what both the larval phase and the cocoon phase can look like. Right, so these are just a couple of examples of a Cecropia moth. These are ants holding the larvae, right? So a lot of times these things can go out and really kind of feed and defend themselves, but in some cases, like ants and bees, they're very, very, very dependent, right, on adults to care for them. You have a Japanese beetle, a ladybug, which is so cool because these are vicious little predators. They eat so many aphids. They're just as effective as the adults. And they just don't look like ladybugs until you know what they are, right? They actually look like kind of, I don't know, little weirdos, right? Like little vicious weirdos until you know. You're like, oh, you're just a ladybug, cute. And then we also have a mosquito, right? So this is a mosquito larvae. And so a mosquito, remember, is actually a type of fly, so it goes through this sort of process. And then a couple of similar examples of what you might see in the pupa, chrysalis, cocoon diversity. So ants, these are both ants. These are uncovered. These have kind of a cocoon built around them. A really kind of interestingly camouflaged luna moth, chrysalis, beetle, and then that's the mosquito when it's in its chrysalis or cocoon, which is really cool. So putting this all together, kind of what does complete metamorphosis look like? You have the egg, that's laid. I love this example for the black swallowtail. And then you're going to go through a couple of different caterpillar phases. And remember, there's a molt in between each one of these. I think this is really, really fun because they're going through different forms of camouflage as well. So there's this idea that early on, it's beneficial to look like a bird dropping because no one wants to eat a bird dropping. So that's what they think this coloring is. Whereas by the time you're this big, it's better to just try and straight up camouflage, right? Like if you want to be green like everything else so nothing can see you. Then, right, it goes into its cocoon, finally emerges as an adult. And that's kind of that whole cycle that you might see. So really interesting, really complicated. And all of these forms can be variable, kind of within reason, but so much evolution can happen here. So a little bit about insects in the ecosystem and some of the different roles they play. I love this caterpillar. It's a spicebush swallowtail on spicebush, and they roll the leaves around them to try and hide. But if you were to open one up, you would see this action, which of course is meant to look like a vicious snake to scare you away, which I personally just find adorable, but I'm sure the swallowtail does not want to hear that. Okay. So how do insects help us? What are some of the things they're doing in the environment? So they are improving soil. This is a major function. They're adding organic matter down into soil. They're creating air passages. They're doing kind of all of this work to really improve soil structure. They provide food, obviously, to each other and to everyone else, right? They're often the first link in the food web, which we'll talk about. They're excellent pest predators. So this is really, really good if you are a gardener. Oftentimes, if you have a lot of insects bothering your garden, I would actually argue you don't have a great enough diversity of insects, because if you have a great enough diversity, you also have the predators. So I would say like invite more in, right? Get more pollinator-friendly plants, get more insect-friendly plants, because you want everybody, including the predators. Obviously, they're excellent pollinators, as we know. They make food. These are some of our little livestock insects that we like. And then they're beautiful, right? They're just wonderful and charming and like a delight. Every time you see a really pretty butterfly or a really cool looking beetle, it's just exciting, right? Like it's just kind of cool to see what they're up to. So in thinking about insects in the environment, it's really helpful to take a step back and think about kind of the broader role they play. And like most things in the environment, that means starting with the sun, right? And it means starting with plants. There's a reason we do plants before insects. But so terrestrial energy, right? Energy on land all comes from the sun. So you have the sun giving sunlight, and then plants are producers that capture that sunlight and use it to create sugar and carbohydrates, right? So this is the process of photosynthesis, where they're able to take sunlight and then to really take water and carbon dioxide and to create sugars using the energy of the sun, which is really, really fascinating and really like a gift for all of us that they're able to do that, right? Because that's kind of what makes the whole show go. But plants are not doing that to share, right? Nobody in the natural world really makes a lunch to share. They make a lunch for themselves. And so they're often extremely well defended, and they are doing everything they can to not share that energy. So imagine the grass in this is like some wonderful native plant. We'll say it's actually blue-eyed grass, right? It's not just fescue. But so you have the sun giving energy to the plant, the producer, and it's creating sugars and everything else, right? And then often along comes your primary consumer, which is typically an insect. And it is going to eat the plants, get eaten by a secondary consumer, by a tertiary consumer, by a predator, and then in turn everybody ultimately eats each other, gets eaten by decomposers, right? And so this is how you go from a food chain to a complex food web. All of this energy flow, right? So the energy from the sun is flowing through this whole system. And what's really, really essential about this is that typically you do have to have something like an insect as the primary consumer, linking all of the higher levels back to plants. And that's because plants are extremely well defended. And oftentimes you have these kind of close relationships between individual insect species and plant species where the insects have figured out how to eat that plant, right? And so you might say like, well, we eat plants all the time. They're not that well defended. And you're like, yeah, true, kind of. Like go out and like try to eat like an oak tree, and you'll see that plants are actually very well defended and we are not equipped for that, right? Or just like the fact that humans like to cook things all the time, right? That's because plants are actually quite difficult to eat. Most things we can't eat at all. They're too rough. Our systems can't digest them. Whereas insects have typically figured out, even if it's just a single species or a small handful of species, how to eat everything. And so insects then are actually very easy to eat, right? They're often just like at most crunchy. And so all the other animals and all the other organisms are able to kind of take advantage of that. Not even just animals, right? Like a Venus flytrap can take advantage of that fact. So this is really, really interesting. And so kind of proof of this, and something any of our birders in the crew will have seen this, 96% of North America's terrestrial birds rear their young on insects, right? Not seeds and berries, not anything you put out in your bird feeder, seed, berry, suet-wise. They want insects. And what they really want is caterpillars. And that's because caterpillars, if you imagine, are just like a little soft-bodied protein sugar pack, right? They're wonderful. They're not well defended at all. They're very, very easy to eat. So this is a study from the 60s where a pair of Carolina chickadees brought 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars to the nest to rear one clutch of eggs. Okay, first off, spare a thought for the grad student who had to count that, because that's a lot. But imagine that oftentimes these chickadees are actually rearing multiple clutches per year, right? So to successfully rear these clutches, they need that many caterpillars per clutch. And there have been kind of sadder studies that have shown when the caterpillars are not available and it's just things like bird food and bird seed, the birds will try to bring that to their young and it doesn't work, right? So they need the caterpillars. They need these kind of soft-bodied insects. Insects are also obviously eaten by small mammals, reptiles, amphibians, and of course each other, right? This is an integral first step in the way energy flows through an ecosystem. Another crucial role that insects play, as I'm sure we're all aware, is through pollination, right? And this is a true mutualism. What do I mean by that? I mean that the insects benefit and the plants benefit, right? Both partners in this relationship benefit. So flowering plants and insects diversified together during the Cretaceous. So there are so many species of flowering plants. There are so many species of insects. And part of that is because they were almost like egging each other on to diversify and to kind of evolve to fill all of these different niches, all of these different environments, all of these different kind of ways of being on the earth, right? Because you could go off to you could evolve to fit some far-flung environment as a plant, and as long as an insect could also pollinate you and they were being drawn by the sugar, everything worked, right? So there are all sorts of different things that we see that's really, really interesting with this sort of relationship. When it very first began, the first pollinators were probably beetles and flies, and they were actually really drawn to flowers that were fleshy or rotten or kind of smelled bad, right? Because that's what beetles and flies like. And we still have a lot of plants like that will have kind of dark red, dark colored flowers, maybe the flowers even on the ground, thinking about something like wild ginger. Kind of a rotten smell, unappealing maybe to us, but like beetles and flies are all about it. Later, you have butterflies and bees evolving as pollinators. Obviously, there are also birds that are pollinators, other things that are pollinators, but what's really interesting about this is you start seeing different kind of major forms of flowers, right? And complicated relationships. So here you have a moth, and then you're going to have this flower with a really long, thin tube, right? And so that's that not just any pollinator can get in there, but a moth with a long proboscis, a long feeding apparatus is needed to pollinate that. As opposed to something like up here that's kind of more that snapdragon form, where if you've ever played with a snapdragon, you know they kind of hinge open. And what you need there is you need a fat-bodied bee that can force its way in, right? And so all these different things where the pollinator needs a certain type, or the plant needs a certain type of pollinator, and those relationships have co-evolved, so really only that type of pollinator can access the plant. In the end, about 2/3 of flowering plants are pollinated by insects. It's because a lot of flowering plants are grasses, and they're wind-pollinated largely. Not entirely. But these are really close relationships. And part of what's really interesting about this from a plant perspective even is that oftentimes when you're trying to understand what a plant is, like what it's related to, kind of what it is evolutionarily, look at the flowers first. And that's because if it's an insect-pollinated flower or an insect-pollinated plant, the flowers become very what we call evolutionarily constrained. What does that mean? That means that the flowers, evolution works to keep the flowers just the way they are, to not let them change too much, because they have to be recognized by the pollinator. So oftentimes, I love this, many of the earliest classifications of plants that were done by Linnaeus and others, when those classifications were done based on the flowers, and they were plants that were pollinated by insects, oftentimes those classifications still stand, because the flowers really are kind of this true idea, right? The leaves might evolve into all sorts of different shapes. The overall form might evolve in so many different ways, but if the flower has to be recognized by an insect, oftentimes that means the flower stays the way it is. So I can look at the flower of a plant almost before anything else to understand kind of where it's situated in an evolutionary tree and kind of what other things it might be related to, right? Like pea flowers look like pea flowers, right? Solanaceae, like tomato eggplant flowers, will look like Solanaceae plant flowers. I think that's really interesting. So moving in a little bit to this idea of herbivores, carnivores, and everything else, all the different roles that insects fill in the environment. So we mentioned this earlier, right? Plants are very well defended. Plants are not making sugars for us or for anyone else. They're making them for themselves, and they want to keep them. So plants are very, very well defended. They're defended with thick cell walls, defensive compounds, spines, thorns, prickles, anything, right? You name it. And so in order to get around this, insects have had to evolve really intricate relationships with plants, and they can take really a long time to evolve. They're pretty impressive. And so one of my favorite examples of this is actually in milkweed. And it's not the one you think, probably. So what we think of as milkweed and monarchs, right? Monarch caterpillars are able to eat milkweed leaves, even though it's toxic, because they are able to sequester those toxins in their body, which actually makes them poisonous as adults. But what's even more interesting is that the reason milkweed is called milkweed is because it has a milky sap in its veins. And that milky sap, part of the reason that evolved, we think, is to make it difficult for caterpillars to eat, right? Because they have these little mouth parts, and that milky sap kind of gums up those mouth parts and serves as a defense. And so what monarch caterpillars have evolved to do as well is not only are they able to eat these toxic leaves, but oftentimes when they're eating a leaf, they will first go down into the midrib of the leaf, further down than where they want to eat. And they'll eat through the midrib. And that stops the flow of the milky sap. So then that monarch can eat everything above that point without trouble, right? So that's fascinating, because not only do you have this really intricate, like toxicological thing evolving, but you also have a behavior evolving in the caterpillar, right? So that like they don't have to like test this out and like get told by another caterpillar, right, what to do. They just are evolved to have this behavior, but that takes a really, really long time, right, for something like that to happen. And it also means that you have these really close relationships. And this is kind of true across the board, is that oftentimes insects feed on a very narrow range of host plants, right? Most insects don't eat anything. They eat just like a couple of species, if not one species. And it's because plants are well defended, it takes a long time to develop the ability to eat even one plant, so you're probably going to stick to it. Host specificity can vary between life stages, so this is really important. So monarch caterpillars feed only on milkweed when they're young, but actually as adults, they're generalists, and they're going to feed on many different species, right, for nectar and pollen. There are some insects that are generalists more broadly, things like grasshoppers, Japanese beetles, some aphids, but this is fairly uncommon. It's more common to see something like maybe tobacco hornworm and tomato hornworm, which both of these are extremely closely related species that can both be on tobacco or tomato, right? So there's like 2 species of caterpillars, 2 species of plant, and they can all kind of match up, but you're not going to find a tobacco hornworm on a rose, right? That's never going to happen. So I think kind of the takeaway here, right, is not only that most insects are specialists to one degree or another, but that oftentimes you do also see things where something might be a specialist and, for example, a leaf eater in one stage of life, whereas it's a generalist and a nectar eater in another stage of life, right? So these things can change, especially when you're thinking about things that undergo complete metamorphosis. The other great generalists are often predators. Most predators can eat a lot of different insects because they're not as well defended, and that always works kind of to the benefit of the gardener in that if you invite the predators in, typically they'll start clearing everything out, which is great because you don't mind losing a few beneficials if you're also losing most of your pests. And so part of what I really want you to take home from this whole section as well is that these relationships are very complicated. They take a long time to evolve. We don't really ever fully understand them. You know, humans always want to think we've got it like pinned down, but these are really, really complicated relationships. And so coming back to this idea of the monarch, this is one of my favorite stories because it's just crazy. And then this is just what we know, right? Like this is just what we know. There's so much more complicated than this. So you have monarchs and you have monarchs and milkweed. This is a picture that my dad took that I was looking at a couple of years ago and I realized not only, I thought it was nice because it's a picture of a milkweed or a monarch caterpillar or milkweed, but actually when you look more closely at it, it's actually got that flagging behavior too, right? So this little guy has already chewed through that mid stem right now there, and now he's above it, getting ready to eat, you know, unencumbered by all that milky sap. So we have this complicated relationship that has evolved between these butterflies and caterpillars and their host. And then something we've learned about monarchs actually quite recently, right? So within the last, and by we, I mean, I guess, American researchers, because obviously people already knew about this, people who lived in these areas, but something that was discovered right within the last 100 years and even less in many cases is that monarchs undergo these massive migrations where they're migrating, you know, from so far north down into Central America. They're migrating over into California, right? They're doing these huge annual migrations the way a bird would. That was actually not well understood for a long time. You have an interesting relationship between monarchs and another caterpillar called the viceroy. So the viceroy is not toxic, right? The viceroy's plan in life is to look like a caterpillar, or to look like a monarch. A monarch is toxic and can't, like, it will make a bird vomit or be sick if it eats it, but the viceroy is not toxic. And so the viceroy, as long as it mimics the monarch well, is protected by the monarch's toxicity, right? Part of this is probably a study that could not be done anymore, but they actually did a study at one point where they tried to figure out how effective that actually was, and they fed blue jays, monarchs, and viceroys. So this poor unwitting monarch, or this poor unwitting blue jay, he's very excited to have a tasty treat. He eats it, he wanders on, he throws it back up. And so this is an interesting evolutionary story too, because again, monarchs are toxic, viceroys are not. So if there's an area where there's a lot of monarchs and not that many viceroys, the viceroys are protected because most birds will on average eat a monarch first. And they'll say, oh, that orange and black thing is toxic, don't eat it. Whereas if the viceroys are a lot more common than the monarchs, nobody's protected. Because the birds on average are eating viceroys mostly, so they just keep trying, right? And they might hit a bad one occasionally, but they're like, yeah, but I ate 5 and it was fine. I ate 1 that was bad. Maybe it was just a bad one, right? So there's this really interesting kind of balancing selection there going on from an evolutionary perspective where the monarchs and the viceroys have to be in the right proportion to each other as well. And then to make the monarch story even more complicated, there's actually a whole bunch of different species of milkweed. And there's this idea that some of these tropical milkweeds that have been introduced recently might be a big problem for migration because they flower longer and the monarchs are kind of tempted to stay around longer, in these northern parts of their range. And then they're not doing the migration early enough and they're not completing it successfully, right? And so these are all these just kind of different like facets and like side stories for one thing, right? For monarchs. These are really complicated stories. They're massively co-evolved. They take so much time. There's so many different species at play. There's so many intricate connected webs and networks for everything, right? And so we have to be a little bit careful about assuming that we can go in and like do the right thing without having a lot of humility in that process and without saying, like, we might know what we think is 90% of the story might turn out like 13. So, you know, we might not know a lot less than we do. We often know a lot less than we do. And we just have to kind of be in awe of how complicated these situations are and try to preserve what we can as best we understand it without getting too clever about future solutions, if that makes sense. Okay, so lots of insects. We're going to change tacks a little bit. We're going to talk about how we can see evidence of insects, what that might look like through this next section. Oftentimes you're not going to see the actual insect itself, but if you know what the damages you're looking at, you can get a sense of what type of insect might have caused what you're seeing, or kind of more broadly, like what group of insects were acting where you are, right? So we're going to talk a little bit about different patterns of feeding, nesting and egg laying, and finally some diseases that insects help transmit. So insect mouth parts. The different major orders of insects, so the different major groups of insects, really can be thought of as like their mouth parts for the most part, right? Like some of them, not all of them, but in general, you can think of them as their mouth parts. So oftentimes beetles have chewing mouth parts, whereas bugs have these piercing, sucking mouth parts. Butterflies and moths have siphoning mouth parts. Flies often have these sort of chewing, lapping mouth parts. Similarly, they might have spongy mouth parts, right? So it's going to be bees and flies. It's going to be mostly flies. So typically, if you're seeing a lot of chewing damage, you're seeing something like a beetle, or maybe you're seeing, you know, a juvenile moth, so like a caterpillar. So for chewing mouth parts, some of the leaf feeders we're going to run into caterpillars, beetles, both adults and larvae might use chewing, grasshoppers. So what are we looking for? We're looking chewing marks and holes, frass, that's a fancy word for insect poop, webbing. All of these things can indicate kind of something in this sort of group. Webbing is less common, but certainly can be present, especially when you're thinking about caterpillars. Leaf miners are fascinating because they're more discerning, right, than that. So a general chewing mouth part is like, I don't care, I'm just going to eat whatever is in front of me. A leaf miner is just wants the tender bits, right? It doesn't want the top of the leaf or the bottom leaf. It just wants the tender cells between the top and bottom, which I think is really charming. So they're eating the mesophyll cells, and they don't eat those kind of outer epidermal cells. This is usually fly larvae when you see this sort of patterning, or when you see these kind of puffy chambers. The damage is usually relatively minor. It's not a big deal. I actually always think this is really kind of pretty. A lot of times you'll see this on things like Arqualesia or some other plants that kind of have those delicate leaves. It's a really interesting little pattern, and it's just literally a little fly larva just going through there, munching out all those cells. Leaf skeletonizers are a little bit hardier than that, but they still don't like to eat the veins. So they're going to eat basically all the epidermal leaf tissue, but they're just going to stay away from the veins. And the skeleton is what remains, and it's often got this really interesting kind of lace-like texture. These are not quite as... The major one of these you're going to see around here is not native. It's going to be a Japanese beetle, but like when you see it, boy, you'll see it. You know, like you'll know what it looks like. Another insect sign you'll run into will be borers, or like another insect type of, I don't want to use the word damage, but another sign of insect action, right, is going to be from borers. This is often beetles and moth larvae, and they can either feed under the bark, right? So I think you've all seen this probably before when you peel back the bark on an old fallen log, and you'll see all these trails and everything. Sometimes they also will drill directly in. So what you're going to see is you might see sawdust, holes, tunnels. You might sometimes see secondary disease. If these are plants that are in your landscape that you really like, it's unfortunate because oftentimes there's not really good treatment because the insects are already inside the tissue and it's just not easy to treat or get to them. Ambrosia beetles are not native, but I want to talk about them for a minute because they're fascinating. So what they do, there's a number of different species of ambrosia beetle, and they drill into stems of trees, and they bring their own fungus, which I think is really cool. Each species of ambrosia beetle has its own associated fungus that it carries with it on a specialized structure on its body, and it drills into that plant it creates a little chamber and then it infects the chamber with that fungus because its offspring only eat the fungus. So they're actually kind of just creating a home and like a little nook full of fungus. And that fungus is not actually typically bad for the plant. It's just that now the plant's open to sort of other funguses coming in and other diseases coming in. We also see piercing sucking mouthpart action. So this is typically when an insect uses its proboscis to pierce and then to suck out either specifically sugars or chlorophyll or green containing cells or whatever else it might be. So you're going to see discoloration, which is where you see removing cells containing chlorophyll, like you'll literally see these whiter spots. Sometimes if it's in very small areas, it's going to be stippling like this, where it's like they took a paintbrush with a lighter color on it and stippled all over it, right? Because specific areas were removed. You can also see distortion. This is because oftentimes the insects will inject a compound to keep phloem, so like sugars flowing through the plant, and that will cause distortion of upper leaves. One of the knock-on effects you often see from this sort of insect is honeydew and sooty mold. So for an insect like an aphid that has piercing sucking mouthparts, it is sucking all of this phloem out of the plant, and it's getting a lot of sugar, but it actually wants protein, so it has to take more and more and more, and then it puts the sugar out the back. So you have sugar water falling onto all the leaves and everything below it. That's called honeydew. So this is, sometimes you'll see this, like you'll go outside and like plant leaves will actually be like sticky and you kind of wonder what happened. That's honeydew because there was some sort of piercing sucking insect feeding up above. That can attract ants and wasps, which can be cool or annoying depending on your feeling that day. More problematically, sooty mold is a fungus that then grows on the honeydew and it actually blocks light from getting to those leaves, so it impedes photosynthesis. This is not great. It can be cleaned up, but oftentimes it just means that you should be aware that you have some sort of piercing sucking insect action above whatever you're seeing that's covered in this sticky or this black. Egg laying is fascinating because it can do so many different things, right? This is like a major kind of telltale sign of insects, but it's my favorite thing is gall forming because galls are crazy. Like just put simply. So what a gall is when an insect lays an egg into plant tissue and then that causes the plant to grow irregularly around that egg or to create an irregular formation. And it could be kind of what we think of as a stereotypical gall like this. It can be these strange shapes like this. There's a gall, I think it's like a oak sower gall, I think is the one around here, where it's white and fluffy with pink dots on it, right? Like it looks like something out of a Dr. Seuss. They're fascinating, right? And these are all just a way for insects to kind of co-opt the cellular machinery of the plant to get them to form a structure that the insect wants and that protects and feeds the insect, which is really fascinating. And just, again, another really intricate relationship. Twig girdlers, there are a number of beetles that do this. What is going on here is that the beetle only wants to lay eggs in recently dead twigs, so it girdles the twig so it dies, right? It chews all around that edge, so it dies, and then the twig drops. They usually don't cause serious damage, but they can be severe on fruiting twigs of pecan, but like that's pretty niche. So if that's not the thing, don't worry about it. I just think this is really interesting that the insect is able to kind of create the habitat it wants, right? A recently dead twig, even if it's not already available. And finally, insects can cause disease, or not cause disease, transmit disease. And the reason for that is because if you have all of these insects flying around with piercing, sucking mouthparts, you imagine they're essentially just like a non-sterilized needle, right? And so if disease is on one plant, they're going to move it to the next plant. There are over 200 plant diseases that are spread by insect vectors, and they're going to spread either directly by feeding or indirectly by like wounding. This can be more of a problem with fruit trees, but it can happen to kind of just native wild plants as well, and it's always kind of something they have to be concerned about. But again, if a plant is overall healthy, typically things can fight this off. So many different ways that insects can impact plants, so much more than just pollinating flowers, right? All of the different types of feeding, gall forming, disease transmission, all these relationships are really close and really tight. Okay, so we're going to shift gears a little bit, and we are going to talk about insect diversity. So you've heard me say this a couple times already, but insects are organized into orders, like all organisms are, right? If we haven't covered this already, organisms are always organized, right, by kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. And a lot of times we end up thinking about things at the family, genus, species level. But orders are really, really helpful for kind of understanding the broad trends of groups. For insects, most orders end in the suffix -tera, or patera, depending on the letters ahead of it. It's the Greek word for wing, and it describes wing anatomy. And that's because this is just so important for how many insects navigate the world. And so you don't need to know all this. Don't even worry about it. It's just helpful to know that there are so many different orders of insects. And we're just going to go through a couple of the ones that are some of the major heavy hitters that you're going to run into. But all of them are interesting in their own right. All of them have kind of all these really cool relationships and things going on. And so just for what I was telling you earlier, right? So here's Mantodia, the mantids next to Blatodia, the cockroaches next to Isoptera, the termites, right? They are their own special little party, which I think is just, I don't think of those all being at the same party, but they are. Okay, so we're going to start with the kings, right? Coleoptera. So this is the largest group of insects, 300,000, 400,000. There are about 24,000 plus in North America. They're a third of all animal diversity. They undergo complete metamorphosis, like we discussed. They have chewing mouth parts, right? So they're going to do that sort of chewing damage that you see. They can be herbivorous or predaceous. And they have 2 pairs of wings. And the elytra protect the flight wings. What does that mean? So on a beetle, most insects, if they have wings, have 2 pairs of wings. In beetles, this first pair, this upper pair, these are now called elytra. They have hardened significantly to protect the lower wings. This is so that when beetles go underground, when they're burrowing, that those lower wings are protected and they're not going to get damaged, right? This means that beetles kind of fly like potatoes. If you've ever watched like a Japanese beetle, like, woo, right? Like they're not super graceful flyers, but they can both fly and burrow underground, which is really, really good for them. For the most part, the grubs are going to be underground and the adults fly around, but that is certainly not true by it's not true for everyone by any stretch of the imagination. So for example, this is the Carolina tiger beetle. Its grub is a predator, right? This is Japanese beetle. Its grub is a white grub underground. Granulate ambrosia beetle I told you about. It's a grub that's actually highly cared for by its parents with all of that fungus that it brings in. Right, the ladybug that we showed you, that's a beetle. Its grub is also highly predaceous, right? So some of these grubs are going to be fat little white things you find underground, and some of them are going to be gnarly predators that are like roving around killing things, right? Which is super cool. So much diversity in this group. Also, this is just beautiful. Next group we're going to think about is Lepidoptera, the butterflies and moths. Most of the insects in this group, of which there are about 180,000, over 11,000 in North Carolina or North America, most of them are moths, with some being butterflies. Like we think of moths as being night flying butterflies, but it's actually more accurate just to think of butterflies as being day flying moths because most of them are moths. They undergo complete metamorphosis, right? So caterpillar, cocoon, butterfly or moth. This is a great one where you can see that there's a change in what they're eating and how they're eating at different points in their life. So larvae have chewing mouth parts, the adults have a coiled sucking proboscis, or no mouth parts. There are a number of really fat-bodied moths that when they emerge as adults, they have no mouth parts because their only goal is to mate and they're not going to live very long, right? So they don't even bother with feeding, right? Like they just get down to business and accomplish what they need to. These are often referred to as gonads with wings. And so they have 2 pairs of uncovered wings, right? So they don't have anything like the elytra. What's really interesting about their wings is that they're covered in tiny, tiny scales. So this is what that wing looks like under a microscope. And those scales help with color, flight, thermoregulation. And one interesting thing in butterflies, and this happens in some other insects too, but it's kind of like the most charismatic story of it is in butterflies, is that there are a number of really brightly colored blue butterflies, like the blue morpho is a tropical one, where they're this really, really beautiful bright blue color. Blue is actually extremely rare in nature. It's very, very hard to produce, like true blue. And so the way they accomplish that color is that these scales do what's called structural color. So if you were to take that butterfly's wings, and you shouldn't do this, but if you were to grind them up, it would no longer be blue. It would just be dust. It's structural color. So in the same way that if you think about like the underside of a CD and you can get it to flash different colors, they've actually evolved just the right structure to only reflect blue so that it makes it appear blue. But it's not the same as if you had like a blue dye or a blue pigment, because it's easier to break it, right? And so it's very easy to just break it and you lose the blue, as opposed to something that is truly blue, if that makes sense, which is cool. All right, one of our next really high species groups are the flies, also known as Diptera. There are about 155,000 species worldwide. They undergo complete metamorphosis. They have piercing, sucking, or lapping and sucking mouthparts, right? So we know that a mosquito has a piercing, sucking mouthpart, whereas a housefly has a lapping, sucking mouthpart. The way their name comes from the fact that they only have one pair of full wings, so diptera, right? 2 wings as opposed to 4 wings, like in most insects. What has happened with flies is that, and this is a good example of it here, is that one pair of wings, you can see them back here, these tiny little structures, have evolved into what we call halteres. And they are actually like tiny little rudders. And so instead of having that full second pair of wings, they have these real precise, fine-tuned rudders that help them fly even more kind of with more precision, I guess I would say. And so it's one of the reasons like houseflies are just the worst, right? Is because they're so hard to kill, because they're such strong and kind of clean flyers. And it's partially because of those halteres. One of the interesting things about flies is they often mimic other orders, especially Hymenoptera. So the ants, bees, and wasps we're going to get to, right? So this is one that's kind of mimicking a hummingbird, but you'll see a lot of flies that look like bees, which is cool. So moving on to the bees, the Hymenoptera, the ants, bees, and wasps. We have over 500 species of bee here in North Carolina. These are some of our native bees as well as some ants. Remember, honeybees get all the press, but they are escaped livestock. Our native bees are really, really phenomenal. It's actually a wasp. They undergo complete metamorphosis. They have biting or biting sucking mouthparts. Stings are not bites. Stings are typically, the way that bees are able to sting us is that they have highly modified their ovipositors, so their egg-laying structures, to be stinging structures. This also means that most of the time you get stung, the vast majority of times you get stung, it's by a female. One of my favorite little things about this, is this is a carpenter bee, and male carpenter bees have this big white spotch on their face just right there. A female carpenter bee wouldn't have that. It's big enough that if you actually look at a carpenter bee when it's trying to intimidate you, you can see that big white splotch, because typically the ones that get in your face this time of year are males. And it's all show, right? They don't have ovipositors. They're males. They don't have egg-laying structures. And so those ones that are getting in your face and trying to tell you to back off your own porch, you could catch them on the wing and they'd be fine, right? You wouldn't get stung. And as long as you were gentle with them, they would just be kind of probably miffed that they were not taken more seriously, but they can't even sting you. Hymenoptera have 2 full pairs of wings. The name comes from the fact that they are these highly transparent, very, very thin structures. So hymen and ptera, Hymenoptera. And they range from truly social, also called eusocial, to solitary. So true sociality is going to be what you see in a lot of bees, or honeybees. It's what you're going to see in a lot of ants. And that's where you have a queen and you have workers that are no longer reproductive, and you have this whole intricate caste structure, as opposed to solitary, which would be bees that only it's like 1-2 nest, right? And sometimes they will have multiple solitary bees in one area, like ground nesting bees, but they're still 1 to a nest. And there's kind of everything in between too. So you'll have cases where maybe it's a small handful of bees or ants that get together to have a nest, but often, like, the greatest numbers of these insects are found in the truly social or eusocial nests, but most species are going to be solitary to only slightly social. So most of them also don't want to fight you because if you're truly social and your only goal is to protect the queen, you'll die in that fight, right? Like, whatever, that's your whole point. Whereas if you're solitary and your goal is to reproduce and reproduce as much as possible, you don't want to die in that fight because it's not your goal, right? So it's helpful to keep in mind that most of what you're going to see out there doesn't want to sting you. Oh, and one of the things that can be really, really important for identifying this group is they do always have these really tiny pinched waists. It's actually how you tell an ant from a termite, is that an ant will have a very, very tightly pinched waist, whereas a termite looks like a grain of rice with legs. Okay, Hemiptera. So these are the true bugs, aphids, whiteflies, scales, cicadas. This is an extremely diverse group. Extremely, extremely diverse group. There's 80,000 species worldwide, but man, they can just look so different from each other. They undergo gradual metamorphosis, meaning that, they hatch from the egg and they just get slowly bigger, maybe change color, add wings, but they stay generally the same body shape. Some, like aphids, can reproduce asexually. So you only need 1 aphid to get a lot more aphids. These guys have piercing sucking mouth parts. That's just one of the marks of the Hemipteras. They all have piercing sucking mouth parts. And they typically have 2 pairs of wings, although some are wingless, some are immobile, right, like these scale insects. So kind of anything goes when it comes to Hemiptera. And so this is a slide that I include just to kind of demonstrate some of the diversity you might see in Hemiptera, right? You have the stick bugs, you have lacewing bugs, right? You have you have water bugs. Like, normally they'll have like bug in their actual name, except for a ladybug, not a bug. You have cicadas, you have leaf hoppers, right? And so typically, oftentimes, you have scales and aphids. There are a lot of things in here that are hard to identify as Hemiptera, but this body shape that I see sometimes always kind of screams Hemiptera to me. And what that is it's like, I think of it as like shoulder pads and then a back, right? So you have it here, you have tiny shoulder pads here, but you have kind of this big back plate, right? And it's not hard like a beetle most of the time, but it is kind of a pronounced back plate that kind of obscures the shape of the body, if you can see that. That's kind of a hallmark of Hemiptera. If you see something out there, though, and you're not quite sure what it is, and it doesn't seem like anything else, maybe it's a Hemiptera. And finally, the last one in this group that we're going to talk about is Odonata. This is dragonflies and damselflies. I like to include these because they can be excellent indicators of water quality. And so it's just kind of good to have them in the mix. There aren't as many species of Odonata as the other things we've covered, but again, they just fill this really important niche. There's about 6,300 species worldwide, and they undergo gradual metamorphosis. The young phases can be called a nymph or a naiad, and they are really skilled aquatic predators, so they live in the water, which is why they're such good indicators of water quality. They're the only order with direct flight. What do I mean by that? So the muscles that power their flight are directly attached to their wings. Most insects, the way they fly is that the muscles actually distort the thorax. It's like, are your muscles going to move your back that moves your wings, or are they going to move your wings directly, right? So these are direct. They're going to move your wings directly. Makes them excellent flyers, and the front wings, or the front legs, are adapted for catching things in the air, right? So they're extremely talented, extremely skilled flyers. They can just nab things on the wing, which is amazing. Telling the difference between dragonflies and damselflies, dragonflies are generally larger and hold wings flat when they're resting, right? So this is a dragonfly. Those wings are held flat. Damselflies are more delicate and fold wings along the body when they're resting, right? So dragonflies are often bigger and they're going to hold their wings like this. Damselflies are going to hold, you can't really see that, but back behind, and they're a little more delicate. Okay, so it's kind of a broad overview of insects. What they do, where they fit, kind of a who's who. And we're going to switch gears a little bit now, and we're going to talk about what we can do to help insects, how we can support them, and kind of what is going on in our understanding of what's happening to insect populations broadly. So this article is a little bit older now, but you might have seen it. The insect apocalypse is here, right? So this came out in the New York Times Magazine in 2018. And it's kind of devastating. It's a devastating read. It talks about, population decline in insects, what's going on, how much are we losing? Spoiler alert, a lot. And it's an interesting article, and it just really points to this idea that so many different species of insects the populations are declining like pretty precipitously, right? Like they're really dropping off. And so there was a little bit of pushback to this article, right? There was a follow-up piece published in 2019, which is the insect apocalypse really upon us, right? Where they were trying to say like, oh, this is overblown. This is kind of dramatic. They actually quoted a really phenomenal researcher from NC State to try and like lay out this counter argument. Her quote is not, I don't find it comforting at all though. So this is Dr. Elsa Youngstead. She's amazing. And so they're the most diverse group of organisms on the planet. Some of them will make it. I love that they included that to try and be like, it's going to be fine. I don't read that statement as it's going to be fine, right? These populations are dropping off. So what does that actually look like practically speaking? I'm going to show you some graphs here. Don't worry, we're going to talk through them. So what does the evidence of decline really look like? So one of the ways that researchers approach this is they did meta-analysis where they pulled together a whole bunch of different studies of insects. And they looked at basically all insects with documented population trends across research. And they found that on average, 33% are declining. But it's really variable which types are declining, right? So what does that mean? So along here, you have the percent of insect species in an order, and here you have the orders, right? So Coleoptera, beetles; Hymenoptera, ants, bees, and wasps; Lepidoptera, butterflies and moths; Odonata, dragonflies and damselflies; and Orthoptera, this is going to be like grasshoppers, katydids, and their allies. And so what they find, right, is that like when we think about beetles, right, over 60% of the populations documented are decreasing. Ants, bees, and wasps, maybe 45%. All of Orthoptera, right? Perhaps positively, a couple of beetle orders are improving, or a couple of, right, Hymenoptera, Lepidoptera, and Odonata are improving. But in general, what we're finding is that everywhere we look, we see evidence of decline. It's just, are you in one of the groups that was more impacted or less impacted, knowing that everyone is impacted, right? The other thing they did was they looked at insects kind of more broadly. And so what you can think about this is that we have years here on this axis. And then this is an index of invertebrate abundance. What do I mean by that? Is that if in 1970 you set that level as 1, if that level were to maintain, it would stay here. If the level goes down, it's going to drop below 1. If it goes up, it's going to go above 1, right? And that green, you can see that greeny kind of pea green color, you can see is the noise around these numbers. But in general, what's happening is if you look at just Lepidoptera, butterflies, and moths, they are absolutely declining. And if you look at all other invertebrates, they're declining even more than butterflies and moths, right? To the point where you're looking at this is well below half, right? This might be a quarter of what it was in 1970. And this is what we call, and what's referred to in the original New York Times Magazine article I showed you, as the windshield phenomena, right? So if you were to go out for a drive on a nice day in 1970, you come home, your windshield is like trashed, right? Like you have to clean it off. It's like full of dead insects. Whereas if you go out now, it's mostly clean when you get home, right? So there are just so many fewer insects just kind of ambiently around. And what does that look like? Practically speaking, it's an average decline of over 45% across all observed insect populations. right? So some species are going to be more impacted, some less impacted. Everybody is impacted though, right? There is a well-documented global decline in insect populations. And the reason this is such a huge problem, right, is because they are our primary consumers in most ecosystems. They are how we move energy. They are how we open up kind of the power of the sun to everybody else. And so the question then becomes like, why? What's causing this decline, right? And we don't know, but there's some evidence. So this is a study I think is really interesting. It was done by a former collaborator of mine when he went to a different lab. But what they were really interested in is like, so we know we have this really charismatic story of monarch and milkweeds, right? Like everyone knows this story. But what actually caused the decline in monarchs? So how did that actually work? And so there was an idea, this was 2019, so the study started before that, but so we can say 10 years ago, that monarchs were declining because if you looked at it, monarchs started declining around the same time that milkweed started declining, that genetically modified crops started becoming popular. So what does that look like on this graph? So this graph, again, we're going to have years on this axis from 1900 to 2000. This is going to be relative abundance of monarchs, and this is relative abundance of milkweed. What to pay attention to here is that if a line is sloping down for either monarchs or milkweeds, obviously that means abundance is going down. If the line is sloping up, abundance is going up. You don't need to know exact numbers. What we're talking about is just kind of the relative abundance of that either monarch or milkweed compared to what it had been historically, right? So if you zoom in on just this tiny portion right here, what you're going to see is both of these lines are sloped down, right? Oh my gosh, they're both sloped down at the same time that genetically modified crops become such a big deal. Well, kind of, right? Those lines actually started sloping down a lot earlier than that. They started sloping down. Monarch line started sloping down actually a little bit after in the 1950s, right? Well before genetically modified crops were on the scene. And what really happened here is that the milkweed line started sloping down right before 1950, right? So obviously milkweed populations start going down and then slowly monarch populations start going down, right? It's the only food source. And that makes total sense, right? Because what's happening in the middle of the century is a massive overhaul of our agricultural systems, of how we grow things, of how we do kind of life, right? This is like the post-war boom, and everything that needed to happen to support a growing population means that habitat's getting destroyed, agriculture's changing, everything's changing, so milkweed populations go down. And so how many of our insects are we losing simply because we're managing land in such a different way? And so a number of researchers looked into that, what are the causes of this broad insect decline? And number one really is habitat destruction and degradation, right? So whether that's for homes, whether that's for cropland, whatever it is, even this sort of management style, right, where we're managing maybe hundreds of acres at a time as opposed to smaller parcel with like hedgerows and windbreaks in between, which create buffers, right? That's really different, and it's going to support different levels of native plants and pollinators. Pollution obviously is a big factor, including pesticides, but not limited to pesticides, right? So just kind of if you have way more people, you have to do way more of everything, right? And that causes pollution. Biological factors, and finally climate change, right? So these are going to be things like just kind of more broader trends in terms of what's available for habitat, but also like, are there pests that are present that didn't used to be, other diseases that present used to be, and of course climate change. What we're going to see, right, is a shifting of ranges of plants, shifting of ranges of insects, and they might not always match up the way the plants or the insects need. So what can we do to help, right? We're here as master naturalists. We want to help. That's what we want to do. And before I dive into this section, and we are coming toward the end, I want to make a note on urban landscapes, right? This is just a picture I use all the time. And it shows, right, the soil's been scraped, everything's been compacted. We're in a really, really modified environment here when we're in a neighborhood like this, right? There's been drastic changes in soil and water movement and chemical contaminants. And it's okay to admit that we have to have an active hand in managing these landscapes and that they won't be the same, right? These highly urban environments are not going to be what they were before a city was here. They're not going to be that anymore. They've been too modified. They've been too changed. It's not realistic. But what we can look at is what is possible here, what can be incorporated, where can we use natives when possible. In the case of non-natives, where can we stay away from that when possible, but be judicious in the use, given that there's actually nothing really all that native about this landscape anymore, right? And so it's not realistic to try and go back in time, but it is realistic to say, like, what is the native context that we would like to fit into, and how do we do that as efficiently as possible, keeping in mind that we are in these highly, highly, highly modified environments, right? For example, when you learn soil science, there's like soil science as it applies to the world, and then there's what we call an urban soil complex, right? Like, they don't even get mapped the same way as these sort of more normal natural soils, right? Everything changes in cities, and we just have to figure out how we can do our best and kind of be humble as we approach the problem. So obviously, as we all know, move away from pest-free. This cannot be our goal for our landscapes. It cannot be our goal for what we want. I mean, Nandina has a whole host of problems, but aside from that, things like loropetalum, like all these other plants that are sold as pest-free, or even this goal of having a pest-free environment, is completely unrealistic. And it's also unproductive, because it just means that nothing was able to eat what you put out, which is not good, right? Like, we want to support habitat. So we want to incorporate native plants and pollinators whenever we can. And I'm preaching to the choir here. These are going to be some examples you're going to see from Debbie's garden. It won't look quite like that when you're there, but there are ways to do this that are beautiful, that are impactful, that your neighbors will love, everybody will love. And it is a wonderful, beautiful space to be in as a human, and it supports all the critters around you as well. These are some great pictures. This is one of Debbie's that I just think is beautiful, because those eggs are just mesmerizing to me. I can't even believe that. This is a great picture of nature fighting back. One of my master gardeners took this and sent it to me. It's one of our local assassin bugs sitting outside of a honeybee hive, picking them off one by one as they come and go, which I thought was kind of funny. Part of this is going to be really cognizant, even as you are picking native plants, about picking things that are also locally adapted, and when at all possible, local ecotypes. And what does that mean? It means that it is not enough to pick a native plant if it's been so highly modified and selected by breeders that it's either not actually all that well adapted, or that its genetics don't match the site anymore. So a great example of this are these, I guess the variety is razzmatazz coneflower. So yeah, technically this is Echinacea purpurea, but it should look like this, right? And when you modify it so it's a double, triple, whatever bloom like this, pollinators can't get in to get the nectar and pollen resources. It's much less efficient, right? This actually becomes kind of useless. Similarly, what happens a lot when we're selecting plants is that people think that purple in the leaves is really, really cool. This is one of the few things that is actually truly documented, both of these are, to be problematic. This is the wild form of this. This is a shining sumac. And that's because purpling is actually a defense compound, and so it makes it harder for things to eat it, right? So this is very, very easy to eat. This is much harder for things to eat, and so research has shown that both double or triple blooms and the addition of purple compounds like that both make things far less valuable for native critters to eat. If you want to learn more about this, I would really encourage you to go look at the Mount Cuba Center trials. These are absolutely fascinating. The Mount Cuba Center is in Delaware, but it's in the absolute upper range of the Piedmont, so they're on the same soil types. So they are a good comparison for this, and they do these multi-year trials of cultivars comparing performance and pollinator attraction. And these are just like fascinating, because it's not always the straight species that is the best pollinator attractor. This is another one where you spare a thought for the grad students, because I think they just make them sit out there and count pollinator visits. But they put out these trials where they'll have pictures of how things look, how they performed in the garden, and also the pollinator visits. So I'm about to show you a figure that has like way too much on it, and you're not going to be able to take it in, but I just want to pull out a couple of things for you, so don't get overwhelmed. So this is an Echinacea pollinator visit chart. And part of what I think is really interesting is that Echinacea purpurea is the second highest bar, so the straight species, but it's actually beat by something called fragrant angel. Fragrant angel is very, very similar, but it gets even more pollinators. These spots down here in red, right? So what you're seeing here is varieties by pollinator visit. These lines down here in red, those are double blooms. All of our double blooms are like take up almost all of our worst spots in terms of pollinator visits, right? So when you have something that looks like this, pollinators don't like it. They don't want it. They don't know what to do with it. So these are pretty, but these are pets, right? They're pretty things in the garden that we like, but they are not serving a purpose in terms of supporting pollinators, really. And yeah, so just a couple of other things I pulled out. We have Echinacea pallida here. We have, Echinacea tennesseeensis, and we have Echinacea purpurea here. And what you can see is, right, there are many varieties of cultivars that are going to get more visits than some of the straight species, although purpurea does quite well. And so the reason I point that out is because from a pollinator perspective, I'm not going to say that all of these varieties are bad. And if they like make your heart happy, like you do you, it's better to have this than something else entirely. But yeah, there are plenty of varieties that get good pollinator visits. They can do a really, really good job. The thing to be more aware of with this, though, is that that's just from a pollinator perspective. The other way you want to be able to think about this is from a local genotype perspective or a local genetics perspective. And this is where it can become really useful to try and source species that are from ethically collected wild and local seed. And that's because we know that those plants are actually genetically matched to our ecosystem and they provide toward the genetic diversity of our ecosystem. And so those can be hard to source. There are some nurseries in the area that do it. There are some botanical gardens in the area that do it. It can be hard to source. I always think of kind of like a straight species, local ecotype, right? Local genetics as being my gold standard. Then I think about probably a straight species, maybe not local genetics though, as very, 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 very good. Maybe some cultivars, but I know they perform well and they're not double blooms or purple leaves. That's great. And then everything else I kind of falls into my category of like pets, right? Like they're charming, they're nice, we like them, but they're not doing as much as what's up here. And your garden doesn't need to be a bunch of perfect, right? That's just not how life works. But we try to mix in as much of the best as we can. And then we have other things that just bring us joy. And we all find that balance in slightly different places. But like, I think we also know the saying, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, right? Having a bunch of native species, whether they're perfect local ecotypes or not, is good. And the pollinators and the other critters will appreciate it. I'm going to move through a little bit of a section here where I'm going to show you some resources on how you can research all of this for yourself. So keeping in mind that many insects feed on a narrow range of host plants and host specificity can vary between life stages, there are a number of genera, so genuses, that tend to support large numbers of species, right? So our classic Doug Tallamy approved is native oaks, but actually also blueberry, goldenrod, and sunflower, if you've got a little bit less space, all support a very high number of caterpillar species, right? So they support really a lot of local ecology, and these are really great. Also, one of them makes blueberries, which is great, and also just delightful unto itself. So if you want to research this more for yourself, I'm about to show you a page of data that's just for illustrative purposes. Again, don't get overwhelmed. This is one of the plant lists from the New Hope Bird Alliance. You can go on their website, check all this out. This is a great one. It is for perennials. You're going to see common name, scientific name, some kind of general plant stats, and then benefit to wildlife. So is it a seed host, a nectar host, a larval host? The number of caterpillars supported, any other kind of special notes about it. And this is really, really interesting because they have one for vines, trees, perennials, kind of everything. And you can go through and look at all of these, and it's really, really helpful What I would recommend doing is there's another resource I'll show you later called the North Carolina Plant Toolbox, put out by Extension, where they also have a bunch of pictures. They have a little bit of narrative about everything. You get one tab open on your New Hope Bird Alliance list. You get one tab open on your Plant Toolbox, and you go through and you just have fun, right? You just learn about the things, and that's really, really cool. Another way that New Hope organizes these lists that I think is very helpful is actually by number of caterpillars supported. So the last one was just all the plants. This is the list reorganized to only include kind of like the top caterpillars supported. This is for trees. Right, again, we know our native oaks up here are heavy hitters at 488, but maybe you don't have room for a massive oak, but maybe you do have room for a river birch. That's still almost 300 caterpillars supported. Right, and so I spent a lot of time talking about milkweed, and I think milkweed is super cool, but remember, milkweed supports monarchs. And that's important because monarchs really need milkweed. But think about something like a black cherry that supports 362 different species of caterpillars, right? I would argue that we really need to be thinking about this both from the perspective of plants that can support a lot and how do we take care of our specialists as well, right? So kind of two different perspectives on if I have limited space, what am I going to plant? As you're kind of thinking through what you can plant in limited space, also think about planting across the seasons because complete habitat really supports all life stages, right? You have to be able to support the caterpillar and the butterfly. Debbie will no doubt be talking about this today, probably with an even more updated list than what I'm sharing, but I love her lists of the top 25 native pollinator plants from North Carolina. These are really geared more towards sun, but they're phenomenal because you have spring blooming, summer blooming, fall blooming, a whole bunch of resources as well. And if you pick even just 2 to 3 species from each season, you can create a well-rounded planting that provides flowers and interest and cover all year long, right? So it doesn't have to be this big, extensive, difficult thing. It can be like 2 from spring, 2 from summer, 2 from fall, see how it goes, right? Try it out, even in a more limited space. So some of these resources I would just really encourage you to check out. Again, New Hope Bird Alliance, the Wildlife Federation does a great job, but it's this plant toolbox. Here's their logo. This is a phenomenal, phenomenal resource put together by NC State. They're adding new information all the time, and part of what's so useful about it is the sheer number of photos involved. So you can see a plant typically in multiple seasons, from multiple angles, different contexts, so you can really kind of see whether it fits what you're looking for. Once you've done all this amazing work, pulling all your plants together, and thinking about how you want to create habitat, make sure you do add a couple of extra amenities. So oftentimes, most people start with something like a bug hotel. It's fine. They're cute. Great to do with kids. Love it. You do need to clean them out. You do need to maintain them because sometimes these can also become a magnet for parasites and other things like that because if you're a parasite of insects and someone put together a magnet for insects, oh, that's a delightful buffet. But they're cute and they're fun and they're a great way to encourage kind of thinking about these things for kids and kind of, if you have an artsy bent, you can make a very attractive one. I prefer the much lazier, much easier brush pile, right? A brush pile is great, not just for insects, but also for all sorts of small animals to have cover, to have a little bit of habitat. Making sure that we leave things a little wild at times, even if that just means leaving your lawn less perfect than you or maybe your HOA might like, right? I had a collaborator one time who used to refer to these as lawn wildflowers. Some of these are not native. Some of the weeds we see show up here and there, but at this point, just having food for pollinators in different seasons can be very, very helpful, and not everything has to be meticulous all the time. My favorite example of this is ground nesting bees. They absolutely love bare soil. So I always think that thin spots on the lawn are not poor attempts at growing grass. They are simply great attempts at providing ground nesting bee habitat. That's my goal I'm doing there. And finally, leaving things like logs, snags, fallen trees, fallen branches. We saw that so much with our forest walks with Johnny Randall. Is that this is so much good habitat, right? Things do not need to be tidy. They don't need to be perfect. We all know that, but this is helpful to share with others as well. Introducing water, either moving or still whenever you can. If it's still, right, be a good neighbor and empty it periodically to prevent mosquitoes. But this sort of habitat is really ideal. It attracts birds, it attracts insects, it attracts all of these different things and kind of creates the entire environment to be a little bit more inviting. So with that, we have covered a lot. I love this photo of Debbie's. It is absolutely beautiful. It shows how wonderful these habitats can be in terms of inviting insects and also inviting humans to enjoy them. I encourage you to reach out to me with any questions you might have. There's an asterisk by my email because I am much better by email, and I'm just willing to admit that. But I would love to hear your follow-up questions. I will be at our insects class as well to help Debbie lead some of the tours, and I'm so excited to talk to you guys more about all of this. So thanks so much for your time.